Namaste, good morning, and welcome to the Vedanta Society of Greater Houston and our class on the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. Om Sarva Jiva Papanashakaranam Bhaveshwaram Swikritang cha garbhavasa deha pashamidrisham Yapitam swalilaya cha yena divya jivanam Yapitam swalilaya cha yena divya jivanam Tannamami deva deva Ramakrishnam Ishwaram Om Shri Vivekanandari Satchishya Supujitaya Shri Sharada Devya Virata Sevitaya Shri Ramakrishna Paramahamsaya Avatara Varishtaya Chate Namaha. We salute Sri Ramakrishna, God of gods and Lord of existence, who of his own free will took on human birth and lived a luminous life of divine play for the destruction of human ills. We salute that incarnation, Ramakrishna Paramahamsa, who was worshipped by pure-hearted disciples like Vivekananda, and who was ceaselessly served by Sri Sarada Devi, the Divine Mother herself. Om Tava Kathamritam Tapta Jivanam Kavibhiriditam Kalmashapaham Shravanamangalam Shrimadatatam Bhuvi Grinandiye Bhuridha Janah. O Lord, your nectar-like words are praised by the wise and full of auspiciousness. They destroy the curse of evil, bring good to those who hear them, and bring new life to those who are scorched by the ills of worldly existence. Magnanimous indeed are they who spread your message. Om Shanti, 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 Hari Om Tat Sat. Om, peace, peace, peace be unto us all. So this morning we will continue our study of the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, where we left off last week, and that is on December 9th, 1883, and we are now at the very top of page 332. So Sri Ramakrishna had just been speaking about how close he felt to some of his intimate disciples, including M, who's recording the gospel. So he continues, once I saw the companions of Sri Chaitanya, not in a trance, but with these very eyes. Formerly I was in such an exalted state of mind that I could see all these things with my naked eyes, but now I see them in samadhi. I saw the companions of Chaitanya with these naked eyes. I think I saw you there, and Balaram too. You must have noticed that when I see certain people, I jump with a start. Do you know why? A man feels that way when he sees his own people after a long time. So here, Sri Ramakrishna mentions a type of spiritual vision which is rare. It's recorded in other religions as well, but it's not common. When you see a vision with the open eyes, you see the world as you normally see it, but there in the midst of the world, you see a spiritual vision. You see a spiritual figure. Like in this case, he saw with his eyes open, not in samadhi, but just in the normal state of consciousness, he saw Sri Chaitanya and his kirtan party, the people who were following him in large numbers, singing kirtan, dancing, etc. So he used to say that the first time he had such a vision was in the Panchavati at Dakshineshwar, where he used to meditate. With open eyes, he saw Sita, the wife of Sri Ram, coming towards him. And she, as often happened in these visions, and not just ones with open eyes, but in his visions of divine figures, she walked up to him and then entered into him, merged into his body. And so he used to say that he thought that because that was the first vision he had with open eyes, that she had bequeathed to him her smile. So he used to say that if you see my smile, you have seen the smile that was on the face of Sita. So again, here he emphasizes that this was not in samadhi, but with my open eyes, I saw Sri Chaitanya. And and then he said that I was at that time in such an exalted state that I frequently had such visions. So after the vision of Sita, then a time came when his mind remained in such a high state where he was frequently seeing such visions with open eyes. But then he goes on, nowadays I see such things in samadhi. That is, when the mind leaves this realm and goes to samadhi. So, of course, the question comes, does that mean that his state had degraded? No, it doesn't mean that. It means that that had served its purpose in his life. And now he was in a different state. With a person like Sri Ramakrishna, it's not that he his mind had been very exalted and his mind was very pure, and now for some reason he had fallen from that state. No, it was a change of state due to whatever circumstances or the will of the Divine Mother. Anyway, then he mentions that you must have noticed that when I see certain people, I jump up with a start. So it's close to an exact translation, but it gives the wrong idea, because you get the idea when he jump up with a start that he sees someone and he goes like that. No, Sri Ramakrishna wasn't restless in that way, and not so uncontrolled that he would actually jump up with a start. It means that his attention would noticeably be surprised at seeing someone, not frightened, not startled, but just, oh. And that was because, as he explains, do you know why? A man feels that way when he sees his own people after a long time. Because when he would see certain people that he had seen previously in a spiritual vision, and when he would see them in the flesh coming to him, he would recognize, oh, this is the person that I saw in that vision. And so he would see them with surprise. Again, not alarm, not startlement, but with, oh, this is that person whom I saw. So oftentimes we get the wrong idea from a translation. And that came after he had just said that speaking about his vision of Sri Chaitanya and the Kirtan party with his open eyes, he said, I think that I saw you there also. I think I saw you there and Balaram as well. So that is well known from the life of Sri Ramakrishna, that he had seen Balaram, his great devotee, in a vision as one of the members of the Kirtan party of Sri Chaitanya, and recognized him when later he saw Balaram, and the same with him. He had seen him in that party also. So, of course, that also brings up the question, well, did Balaram and him look the same then as they look now? No, it wasn't that they looked the same. But Sri Ramakrishna, whose inner vision was awakened and who could see into the depths of a person, he could see that it was the same person. just as when he had seen the cowherd boy dancing with Sri Krishna on the lotus, and then immediately after the future Swami Brahmananda, Rakal, as a boy, came in, Sri Ramakrishna recognized him. So it was a recognition from the depths, not just in the superficial appearance of the face. So, and that we can tell from the fact that when he first saw Narendra, the future Swami Vivekananda, he recognized him as the sage that he had seen in high samadhi, seated in samadhi, one of the 7 primordial sages in a very, very high realm. So when he saw Swamiji, he recognized him as that sage that he had brought down from a high realm to take birth on earth for the Divine Mother's work. And so, of course, it's not that Swamiji looked physically exactly like the sage that he had seen in meditation, but again, he could see into the depths of a person and recognized from there that, yes, this is that sage that I had called. So he continues, I used to pray to the mother, crying, Mother, if I do not find the devotees, I'll surely die. Please bring them to me immediately. In those days, whatever desire arose in my mind would come to pass. I planted a tulsi grove in the Panchavati in order to practice japa and meditation. I wanted very much to fence it round with bamboo sticks. Soon afterwards, a bundle of bamboo sticks and some string were carried by the flood tide of the Ganges right in front of the Panchavati. A temple servant noticed them and joyfully told me. So first of all, he mentions that he used to cry fervently to the Divine Mother for the coming of the devotees, those that he had seen in vision that were to come and were not yet coming. This was at a time after the death of Mathur Babu and after his marriage with the Holy Mother, but before the coming of the major devotees, the circle of his devotees, the inner circle of his devotees. He used to go to the roof of the Chandni or the kutir, go to the roof of the kutir where he had lived for many years and where Rani Rasmani and Mathur Babu stayed when they came to the garden. And there he would cry out, oh Mother, where are my devotees? Please send them. I'm sick of listening to the talk of worldly people. My ears are burning. And so he would pray for the coming of his devotees. So he said, please bring them to me immediately. And then he says that in those days, whatever desire would arise in his mind, it would come to pass. And so that we see in Sri Ramakrishna, we see it also in Holy Mother. In Holy Mother's life, for instance, she would think one day about a devotee. Suddenly, a particular devotee would arise in her mind. She would ask about them, and the next day, the devotee would show up unexpectedly. And so with Sri Ramakrishna, he was what's called Satya Sankalpa. Whatever desire arises in the mind, the external world adjusts itself to fulfill the desire. We have a desire, we want to do something, we want to have something, we want to know something, we want to experience something, and we have to go to all of the work. We have to make an intention, we have to do the things in order to produce the result through labor. But a person of the illumination, whatever they think, whatever idea comes into their mind, the external world reflects it back. Partly because of the fact that they have purified their karma, they have burnt out their karmic attachments. And so there's no complexity in their mind. Whatever their mind thinks, it's reflected back immediately. For us, because there's such a complexity of many lifetimes of karma that is still guiding and determining our lives, that we have a desire, but there's a huge backload of karma that has to be experienced. And so it doesn't reflect immediately. But in their minds, it does. Another reason is the strength of their mind. that their mind is so focused and so powerful that it brings about the effect quickly. And third, it just seems to be a natural law that with the fully illumined, that if a desire arises in their mind, first of all, it's a pure desire, because all impurities have been burnt out of them. And then the universe becomes responsive to them. And so he mentions the incident where he had put a fence of tulsi plants around a planting of tulsi plants around the Panchavati, and he wanted to protect it with a fence to keep goats and cows from eating the plants. The desire arose in his mind to build a fence, and then after some days, the Ganges washed up all of the materials he needed. Later, he wanted to have a place in the Panchavati to practice meditation and seclusion, and all of the materials for a kutir, a little hut, washed up onto the Ganges, and so the hut was built with the materials. In that state of divine exaltation, I could no longer perform the formal worship. Mother, I said, who will look after me? I haven't the power to take care of myself. I want to listen only to talk about thee. I want to feed thy devotees. I want to give a little help to those whom I chance to meet. How will all that be possible, Mother? Give me a rich man to stand by me, unquote. That is why Mathur Babu did so much to serve me. So here also he mentions the desire that arose in his mind. And though he had by this time already met Mathur Babu because he had started work at the Kali temple, Mathur became his great supporter and Rasadhar, the supplier of all of his needs. And so he mentions that he couldn't take care of himself. I need someone to take care of me. That also is said to be a spiritual law, that when a person, and Sri Ramakrishna mentions it in other places, that when a person attains to a very high state, then the universe responds by bringing someone to take care of the person who can no longer take care of himself or herself. And then he mentions that he wanted to feed the devotees. That may seem strange to some, but in India, that's a sacred act to be able to feed devotees. And so Sri Ramakrishna wanted to do that. That's considered to be a source of great joy. It's considered to be a source of great merit, but Sri Ramakrishna was not interested in merit. He was beyond merit and demerit, punya and papa. He wanted to do it because of the joy it brings to feed devotees. And he says that he wanted to give a little help to those that he might chance to meet. So again, just that spontaneous sense of helpfulness which he had. And so he prayed to the mother for a rich man to stand by him. That also may sound strange, but as we know from his life, it wasn't at all for his own enjoyment. Mathur Babu and others like Lakshmi Narayan Marwari tried to force money on him and he wouldn't accept it. He never accepted anything. So it wasn't for his enjoyment. It was so that he could be of help to others. He continues, I said further to the mother, certainly I shall not have any children, mother, but it is my desire that a boy with sincere love for God should always remain with me. Give me such a boy. That is the reason Rakal came here. Those whom I think of as my own are part and parcel of me. So again, those of you who have read the story of Sri Ramakrishna's life know that one day in a vision, the Divine Mother showed him a small child and said, here, this is your son. And Sri Ramakrishna was startled on this occasion and said, what, how can that be? I'm a celibate. I don't have any relations with anyone. How could I have a child? And he was horrified at the very idea. And the Divine Mother said, no, 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 not the child in the normal sense. This is your spiritual son, and he will come to you. He's of the same nature as you. And so Sri Ramakrishna had prayed, as he says here, but elsewhere he says in more detail, he had prayed for someone of the same nature as himself. And so of all of the disciples of Sri Ramakrishna, in some sense, Rakal, Swami Brahmananda, was the closest to Sri Ramakrishna. Swamiji and Sri Ramakrishna had a very special relationship that was equaled by none. But as far as closeness, Rakal was the closest in that sense, the intimate sense with Sri Ramakrishna, because he was his own mind-born son, Manasaputra. The first sages that were born from the mind of Brahma, the creator, they are called the Manasaputras of Brahma, because Brahma creates everything through his mind, through thought, through the power of thought. And so when he creates the universe, he creates these pure souls that become the progenitors of culture, wisdom, spiritual knowledge, all of the arts and sciences, and so forth. And in using the same term, Manasaputra, born, mind-born, Sri Ramakrishna used to say that Rakal was his Manasaputra, his mind-born son, born of his own nature. And so as Rakal, the boy who became Swami Brahmananda, was seen by Sri Ramakrishna in a vision to be the eternal companion of Sri Krishna, and because Sri Ramakrishna knew himself to be Sri Krishna, Rakal, who was the eternal playmate of Krishna, was the eternal playmate of Sri Ramakrishna, born in this form to give companionship to Sri Ramakrishna, but also with a great mission. Swami Vivekananda was not the only one of the disciples of Sri Ramakrishna with a great mission to accomplish. Swamiji had the great world mission, giving a new turn to the whole world. But Swami Brahmananda was very, very important, critically important, in the formation of the Ramakrishna movement. So he lived long after, for 20 years after Swami Vivekananda had passed away, giving form and shape to the new movement that Sri Ramakrishna had inspired. So he not only was especially related to Sri Ramakrishna, but he was very important in in Sri Ramakrishna's mission. The master started again for the Panchavati, accompanied by M. No one else was with them. Sri Ramakrishna, with a smile, narrated to him various incidents of the past years of his life. Master: you see, one day I saw a strange figure covering the whole space from the Kali temple to the Panchavati. Do you believe this? M remained silent with wonder. He plucked one or two leaves from a branch in the Panchavati and put them in his pocket. So Sri Ramakrishna here says that he had once seen a figure, obviously a divine figure, that he had seen covering the whole space, the form of this figure. He doesn't say who it was, that he had seen a figure covering the whole space from the Kali temple to the Panchavati, maybe about 75 yards, something like that, 60 meters, 65 meters, something like that. So a large space, a figure covering that whole space. So we don't know any more of it than that. We don't know if it was seated there, if it was standing there, if it was lying there, or what. But this gigantic figure. And then M just kept silent with wonder. What is M going to say? And so M picks one or two leaves from a branch in the Panchavati and puts them in his pocket. And the master says, see there, that branch has been broken. I used to sit under it. So there was a branch that Sri Ramakrishna used to sit under. And after his sadhana period was over, the branch broke. And actually a root grew out of it down to and rooted itself in the ground, because the banyan tree is one of those tropical trees, ficus trees, that has aerial roots, so that one tree can form a whole forest. sending down roots from the branches and making new trunks. So, M. I took a young twig from that tree. I have it at home. So M was doing the same right now. He'd just broken off a twig with and some leaves and put them in his pocket. I took a young twig from that tree. I have it at home. Master with a smile. Why? M. I feel happy when I look at it. After all this is over, this place will be considered very holy. So that's interesting. M says, after all this is over, meaning when your play, sir, when your play, your divine play is over, then this place will be considered very holy, as indeed it has become, as it became after Sri Ramakrishna passed away. In fact, M, those of you who have read about M himself, know that in later years he used to come often to Dakshineshwar. And whenever he would come to Dakshineshwar, he would go to the trees that remained in the garden from the time of Sri Ramakrishna, and he would embrace them and remain embracing them for a long time, because he believed, as he stated, that the very trees in Dakshineshwar must have been great sages of the past, who incarnated as trees so that they could be present to witness the play of Sri Ramakrishna. So whether you think of that in historical terms or in poetic terms, it doesn't matter. He meant it literally. But no one has to believe such things literally unless they come to a point where they see that it could be true. But he believed it literally. But the important thing for us, whether we accept it literally or not, is the fact that for someone like him, who had by this time, after a year and a half, almost 2 years now, almost 2 years of coming to Sri Ramakrishna, he had developed such great love for Sri Ramakrishna, such great devotion for Sri Ramakrishna, from a person who was English educated, as they called them in those days, and who was very skeptical, had come to one who was completely surrendered to Sri Ramakrishna, very devoted to him. And so everything associated with Sri Ramakrishna had become holy. That's the idea behind places of pilgrimage. That's the idea behind relics, that anything associated with such a great soul, anything associated with them, becomes in itself holy. That's why when we go to Kamarpukur, the birthplace of Sri Ramakrishna, we go to see the mango tree that Sri Ramakrishna himself planted with his own hand, and other such things. Because anything that was associated with such a great soul, the very dirt where they lived, the very soil where they lived, that becomes holy. All of the plants in the area, the very people. So that there were people who, when they would see someone from Kamarpukur, or Jairambati, then they would be moved and inspired devotionally to their depths, not because that person was a great person in themselves, but because they were from the holy place where Sri Ramakrishna or the Holy Mother had come from. And so such people became inspirations just because of their association with the place. Master, what kind of place? Oh, I'll read the previous paragraph again. M had said, I feel happy when I look at it, the twig. After all this is over, this place will be considered very holy. Master smiling, what kind of holy place? Like Panihati? And then M explains, almost every year for some time past, the Master had been attending the religious festival at Panihati. So Panihati is a place on the bank of the Ganges, a little north of Dakshineshwar, but just with a simple pole boat. You can, and nowadays they have little motor boats that will take you up there to Panihati, where there is a religious festival every year, a festival related to the life and devotees of Sri Chaitanya, the Vaishnava place of pilgrimage. It was now evening. Sri Ramakrishna was seated on the small couch in his room, absorbed in meditation on the Divine Mother. The evening worship in the temples began with the music of gong and conch shell. M was going to spend the night with the master. So one of the values of pilgrimage, one is going to a sacred place like Dakshineshwar or any sacred place, is just the place itself has an atmosphere, and one goes there to sort of bathe and be affected by the atmosphere. Even if you don't feel anything, it's said that you benefit by going to a real holy place. But another reason for going to a place like Dakshineshwar is that once you have seen it, you've been to Sri Ramakrishna's room, you've been to the Panchavati, where the Panchavati used to be at least. There's another banyan tree growing there. When I first used to go to Dakshineshwar, the banyan tree Sri Ramakrishna had sat under was still alive, but it eventually was killed. Largely by the abuse it received at the hands of monkeys um, who were uncontrolled from the tree. And so now there's another banyan tree which is planted there. But you go to where the Panchavati was, you go to Sri Ramakrishna's room, where the Kali temple was, you see the arati and so forth. Then when you read something like this or hear it, then it comes to life even more. So we don't need to do that. It's not that that's essential for our spiritual life, no. But that's the purpose of it. So if you've been there and you read this about the evening worship in the temple began with music of gong and conch shell, then it's very easy to feel, to hear the music in your memory, to see the sights in your memory, and so forth. After a time, Sri Ramakrishna asked him to read from the Bhakti Mala, a book about the Vaishnava saints. So the Bhakta Mala, Bhakta means devotee, and Mala, the garland of devotees. So it's a garland of stories about great devotees. So it's a book in Bengali about great devotees. And so it's highly embellished stories about great devotees. But it was one of the few books that Sri Ramakrishna kept with him. So Sri Ramakrishna asks him to read from it. And whenever this happened, it was not primarily because Sri Ramakrishna needed to hear it read. Sri Ramakrishna had a Shrutidhara memory, that is the power to retain whatever he had heard once. Anything he had heard once, he would never forget it. And so he knew all of these stories. He didn't need to have to be reminded of them. He would ask him to read so that him would get the benefit of reading, or so that it would provide an occasion for Sri Ramakrishna to tell him something. Just as Sri Ramakrishna used to ask the future Vivekananda to read from the Ashtavakra Samhita. It wasn't that Sri Ramakrishna needed someone to read to him because he was bored or wanted to be entertained. It was to accomplish a purpose for the person who was reading. So M read, and I'll just read straight through the story. It's a rather long story, and long as far as the usual breaks that I make in this class. There was a king named Joymal who loved Krishna with all his heart. He followed with unfailing devotion all the rites and ceremonies associated with the adoration of Krishna, whom he worshipped under the name of Shamsundar. Completely satisfied with his own ideal deity, he never directed his attention to any other god or goddess. One of the inflexible rules of his devotion was to worship the deity daily till almost midday. He would never deviate from this practice, even at the risk of his wealth or his kingdom. Learning this secret, an enemy king invaded the kingdom during the morning hours. Joymal's soldiers could not fight without his command, so they watched the invasion silently. Slowly, the enemy surrounded the moat of the capital, yet Joymal did not come out of his shrine room. His mother came to him and wept bitterly, trying to persuade the king to fight. He said to her calmly, "Why are you worried? Shamsundar gave me this kingdom. What can I do if he has decided to take it away? On the other hand, none will be able to do me harm if he protects me. Our own efforts are in vain. And actually, in the meantime, Shamsundar, the deity himself, had taken the king's horse from the stable and had ridden fully armed to the field. Alone, he faced the hostile king and alone destroyed his army. Having crushed the enemy forces, the deity returned to the temple and fastened the horse nearby. Joymal, on completing his worship, came out and discovered the horse there, panting and covered with sweat. "Who has been riding my horse?" he demanded. "Who brought it to the temple?" The officers declared that they knew nothing about it. In a pensive mood, the king proceeded to the battlefield with his army, and there found the enemy, with the exception of their leader, lying dead. He was staring uncomprehendingly at the scene when the enemy king approached, worshipped him, and said, "Please permit me to tell you something. How could I fight? You have a warrior who could conquer the entire world. I do not want your wealth or your kingdom. Indeed, I will gladly give you my own, if you will tell me about that blue warrior, your friend. No sooner did I turn my eyes on him than he cast a spell on my heart and soul." Unquote. Joymal then realized it had been none other than Shamsundar that had appeared on the battlefield. The enemy king understood too. He worshipped Joymal and through his blessings received Krishna's grace. Master, do you believe all that? Do you believe Krishna rode on that horse and killed Joymal's enemies? I believe that Joymal, Krishna's devotee, prayed to him with a yearning heart, but I don't know whether the enemy really saw him coming to the battlefield on a horse. Krishna might have come there riding the horse, but I don't know whether they really saw him. Master with a smile. The book contains nice stories about devotees, but it is one-sided. Also, it abuses those who differ with its views. So that interchange between Sri Ramakrishna and him is interesting because he asks him, do you believe the story that Sri Krishna actually got on the horse of his devotee who was doing worship in the temple and rode out onto the battlefield and killed the entire army and bewitched the opposing king so that the king was struck with wonder and then came to worship the devotee Joymal and thereby attained the grace of Sri Krishna. And so, of course, it's a fantastic story. And Sri Ramakrishna asks him, do you believe it? And him always very honest in his answers to Sri Ramakrishna. He says, I don't know. I believe that Joymal might have prayed to Sri Krishna. Maybe Sri Krishna even went to the battlefield and destroyed the opposing army. But whether this was seen or not, I have no idea. So the master doesn't answer himself. He doesn't say, no, this is literally true. He also doesn't say it's not true, it's just a made-up story. So we're left to wonder. We don't know what Sri Ramakrishna himself felt. We just know what him, with his critical, and I mean that in the positive sense, with his critical intelligence, his educated mind, he found it impossible to believe the story literally. But he also knew that he had already seen so many things that seemed impossible that that came to be possible by the grace of God. And so he couldn't bring himself to say, no, this is impossible, nor could he honestly say that, yes, I believe it's true. And Sri Ramakrishna doesn't help him. He just leaves it there. But Sri Ramakrishna does say that the stories are nice. And so whether it's true or not, the purpose of these stories is to give one faith, the conviction and the faith that one pointed devotion and commitment to the deity will take care of all of our problems. So whether Joymal had the kingdom saved by Sri Krishna, or whether Sri Krishna had allowed the kingdom to be destroyed, Joymal, by his single-minded devotion, whatever did happen and whatever might have happened, then that would have been to Joymal's eventual benefit. Because for one who is single-mindedly devoted to God, they may have to go through many, many difficulties. But those difficulties turn out in the end to have been blessings. And so that's the point of the story. Whether it happened historically or not, who can say? I myself doubt that it was a historical story, though like him, I don't know. And Sri Ramakrishna doesn't help us by answering. But the purpose of the story is not to relate history. It's to make a deeper point about the value of spiritual life. So then we skip to the next morning. The following morning, the master and M were talking in the garden. So M had stayed overnight, obviously. The following morning, the master and M were talking in the garden. M, then I shall stay here, meaning he's decided to stay on longer. Master, well, you all come here so often, what does it mean? People visit a holy man once at the most, but you all come here so often. What is the significance of that? M remained silent. The master himself gave the reply. Master, could you come here unless you belonged to my inner circle? That means you all are my own relatives, my own people, like father and son, brother and sister. So that's very significant. Yes, he says that most people go to visit a holy man once. They get a chance to hear about a holy man. They go to see him, to have his darshan, return, and then they're satisfied that they've seen the holy man. But the inner circle of Sri Ramakrishna's devotees come again and again. And that, Sri Ramakrishna explains, is because they are part of his inner circle. They are like his own relatives. They're bound to him by a deeper connection. It's not a casual connection. They're not coming just because they've heard of a holy man and they want to see the holy man, whether out of curiosity or out of a sacred desire to see a holy man, but then their desire is fulfilled and they go on. No, these are tied to him with deeper cords. In a lesser sense, but still a very important sense, a lesser sense than what Sri Ramakrishna is speaking of, because Sri Ramakrishna saw that these souls were tied to him eternally. But many years ago, in the 1986 it must have been, I spent 2.5 months in St. Louis while Swami Chaitananandaji was in India. He had asked me to come and look after the center, give the classes and lectures while he was gone. So I did. I came from San Diego at that time. And there was another Swami in San Diego, so I could leave the center with him in charge and come to St. Louis. And one of the devotees there, I heard many wonderful stories from the devotees in St. Louis about the old Swami Satprakashananda, who had founded the center and whom I had had the blessing to see on a couple of occasions. He was one of those I got to see and speak to who had seen Swami Vivekananda. And so this one devotee told me a story, Ray Ellis, who's now passed away, whose wife is still alive in St. Louis. Ray Ellis was a very close devotee of Swami Satprakashananda and a devotee of the St. Louis Center for many decades. And so he told me that in Swami Satprakashananda's very old age, when he could no longer come downstairs, and so he was stayed on the upper floor where his room was, and where there was also the shrine and a room where he could, or actually the shrine was a floor down, but there was his room and also a room where he could meet with the devotees. And so one day, Ray Ellis had gone to see the Swami, went upstairs to his room, as usual, and the Swami asked him to do some japa, seated there in his presence, just to silently repeat his mantra. So Ray Ellis did so. And then after some time, Swami Satprakashananda said, when a devotee recites the mantra, a golden thread connects the heart of the devotee to the heart of the Guru. And when he said that, Ray Ellis saw that there was a light of golden consciousness connecting his heart to the heart of Swami Satprakashananda. He actually saw the thread of spiritual light connecting him to Swami Satprakashananda. So that was with a guru and a disciple. But Sri Ramakrishna, of course, and that was an extraordinary and a wonderful experience. Sri Ramakrishna is speaking of something even more profound, that these devotees were not connected because of repetition of the mantra, not because of initiation, not because of their devotion, but they were connected by deep bonds over lifetimes. Sri Ramakrishna continues, I do not tell you everything. If I did, would you come here anymore? Once Shukadeva went to Janaka to be instructed in the knowledge of Brahman. Janaka said, first give me my fee, that is the dakshina, the teacher's fee. But, said Shukadeva, why should I give you the fee before receiving the instruction? Janak laughed and said, will you be conscious of guru and disciple after attaining Brahma Jnana? That is why I asked you to give me the fee first. So this is a very beautiful statement, a beautiful story. It's like the story in the the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad about Yajnavalkya. So here, Shukadeva, the great Paramahamsa, the great realized soul, goes to, King Janaka goes to Shukadeva and asks for instruction. And yes, I had it right the first time, yes. That Shukadeva comes to Janaka for instruction, because Janaka was recognized, Janaka Raja, the King Janaka, was recognized as a realized soul. And Shuka came to him for instruction, and Janaka asks him, you give me my fee, the dakshina that you give to the guru when you take initiation. And the reason for giving a fee to the teacher is not so that the teacher can get a lot of money. The idea is it's symbolic, that it's not the quantity of money that you give or your other gift. It's the idea that the teacher is giving you something very sacred, something that's worth more than the whole universe. And so you give a token in recognition of what you have received. And so the tradition says that initiation is not fulfilled unless you give the dakshina to the guru. And so all gurus in this country don't demand it, because it's people here are sick of religious institutions always asking for money. But it is the tradition in India. And so you find that devotees who went for initiation to Holy Mother, like young men and girls who had come to the Holy Mother for initiation, and they had nothing. They weren't even aware they were going to get initiation when they went to Holy Mother, and she said, "Let me give you initiation." And so then the time came after the initiation for giving dakshina, the offering to the Guru. And they had nothing. And so Mother said, go to the box, meaning the box of money for her own household. Go to the box, take out a rupee, and come and give it to me. So it was her own money that they would go and get and give it to Mother, so that the gift should be given and the initiation would be complete. So that's the idea behind the story. And so here, Janaka says, give me the fee first. And Shukadeva asks, why should I give you the fee before you've given me the teaching? And then Janaka explains that once I have given you Brahma Jnana, the knowledge of Brahman, then where is Guru and where is disciple? There's only the non-dual reality. And so I want my fee first before you go into that state and forget who is Guru and who is disciple. Again, if you read in the the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad about Yajnavalkya and the great debate where he asked for all of the cows before the debate was over. You get a similar story. So let me just read a little bit more, because then we'll come to the end of the day. And then I'll see if there are any questions. It was night. The moon rose, flooding all the quarters with its silvery light. M was walking alone in the garden of the temple. On one side of the path stood the Panchavati, the Bakul Grove, the Nahabat, and the Master's room. And on the other side flowed the Ganges, reflecting millions of broken moons on its rippling waves. M said to himself, "Can one really see God? The Master says it is possible. He says that if one makes a little effort, then someone comes forward and shows the way." This is Sri Ramakrishna had said to him just in this chapter. "Well, I am married. I have children. Can one realize God in spite of all that?" He's saying to himself. M reflected a while and continued his soliloquy. "Surely one can. Otherwise, why should the Master say so? Why shouldn't it be possible through the grace of God? Here is the world around me," he continues in his thinking. "The sun, moon, stars, living beings, and the 24 cosmic principles. How did they come into existence? Who is their creator? What am I to him? Life is indeed vain without this knowledge. Sri Ramakrishna is certainly the best of men. In all my life, I have not seen another great soul like him. He must have seen God. Otherwise, how could he talk with God day and night, addressing him so intimately as Mother? Otherwise, how could he love God so intimately? Such is his love for God that he forgets the outer world. He goes into samadhi and remains like a lifeless thing. Again, in the ecstasy of that love, he laughs and cries and dances and sings." And thus the chapter ends. So let me just say a word about this before we conclude. One might wonder, why would M, after all that he's seen and all of the things he's related in here, and remember, he saw much more than what's related here. This is just a small record of the things that he saw and heard with Sri Ramakrishna. Why would he say Sri Ramakrishna must have seen God? Otherwise, how could he talk with God day and night? So instead of saying Sri Ramakrishna did see God, he says Sri Ramakrishna must have seen God. It's because, not that he had doubt, because what he says after this shows that he didn't have doubt. He was convinced that Sri Ramakrishna had seen God. But he had not seen God, and had not seen Sri Ramakrishna seeing God. He had seen Sri Ramakrishna in an abstracted state where he was talking to God. But it's like me seeing you, and you're actually talking to God, but I don't see that you are talking to God. I see that you're in an abstracted state speaking, and speaking as if you're speaking to God. That's all that I see. So M was seeing secondhand through Sri Ramakrishna. It's like we've all done this, where we're in a room with someone who's speaking on the telephone, and maybe it's a conversation that's of great interest to us, and so we're listening intently to what the other person is saying, but we're only getting half of the conversation. We're having to imagine what's going on the other end. Maybe we're even having to imagine who is on the other end. And so that was the condition of M. So it was not a sign of his lack of understanding. It was the fact that he was seeing all of this from the standpoint of himself as an observer of Sri Ramakrishna in an abstracted state. So, but what a great blessing that was. What a great blessing that one could see what M saw with Sri Ramakrishna's many different states of ecstasy and spiritual illumination. And of course, later M had his own experiences and illuminations. So I'll stop here. And if there are any questions, I'll take those. But first, let me give the announcements. And So for announcements on Sunday, there will be the usual Sunday talk at 11 o'clock in the morning. And next week, we will continue with these classes. And the classes will continue through the month in their normal order. And Sunday lectures will continue through the month as well. And then on March 1st, we will have Shivaratri. We're still working up the flyer for that. That will go out March 1st, which is a Tuesday night. And so the time we've decided on is from 7 o'clock until 8:30 because it's a weeknight and people have to go to work. So that more people can come, we'll start at 7 o'clock and end at 8:30. And so we're hoping that if the numbers of the COVID numbers stay steady or continue to go down as they are right now, that we can have it open to all. So that's what we're aiming towards. And then on March 5th, Saturday of that same week, we will have the birth anniversary of Sri Ramakrishna. And that will, the flyer is going out for that also. And we're hoping that also will be open to all. That will be from 10:30 till 12:30. So those are the two events coming up that we hope as many of you can come to as possible, assuming that they are both open. So now questions. When desire is just a passing thought, not something one consciously perseveres to gain, but somehow it does happen, in that case, are you exhausting your good karma? No. As Holy Mother used to say, mental desires that are, as you described, that is not something that you're pursuing, but a desire that rises in the mind, that doesn't dominate your mind. That those don't cause bad effects. It's not that you want them, but one shouldn't be worried about them, and one isn't exhausting good karma that way. Good karma is exhausted through more conscious and intentional action. And so, yeah, that's not to be worried about. Then another, to what extent should we accept our karma versus trying to assert our free will? Do we actually have free will, or is complete surrender what is required? And so that also is a very good question. So the question of free will and surrender, that is a large question in religion itself, in all of religion, even in Buddhism. There are those schools of devotional Buddhism taught mainly now in China and Japan and Korea, which teach surrender to the Buddha. That's not self-effort, but surrender. And so surrender versus self-effort is one of the great questions in religion. And so there are two paths, purushakara, self-effort, and prapatti, surrender. One can follow either one. But the fact is that it doesn't make much difference. Because to surrender yourself to God, that takes tremendous self-effort. Real surrender comes, as Swami Turiyananda said, at a high level of spiritual life, where you have effectively surrendered. Then that is higher than self-effort. But to get there, one has to exert self-effort. One has to practice self-surrender. So whether one takes the attitude that I'm going to do whatever I can to attain to spirituality, I'm going to practice, I'm going to go through the steps, I'm going to go through the disciplines, and I'm going to make the effort, that's good. If that is what is meaningful to you, that's good. If, on the other hand, you are more devotional and you understand the idea of surrender and you want to practice that, then that also is very good. That's excellent. But you have to practice it, and that takes self-effort. And so the way to practice surrender with self-effort and still be honest to the idea of self-surrender is to think as you're to think that whatever comes to me, Let me adjust to circumstances. Let me not try to create circumstances. Let me try to adjust to the circumstances that God brings to me. And that itself takes great effort, because you find that you always want to react to circumstances, you want to change them, you want to alter them. So to practice self-surrender is a tremendous discipline. But if that is meaningful to you, then do that. If, on the other hand, you don't understand what it is or why it is, or maybe you just don't understand how to practice it, then just take to the path of self-effort. Because no matter what you do, you have to begin with self-effort. Uh, the it's more a choice of whether you do self-effort with the idea of trying to surrender, or whether you do self-effort just as self-effort because I want to attain to God, and I understand this, and so I'm going to do what I can do. So yes, there is a difference in the two paths, but both of them require self-effort, because right now, unfortunately, we have the idea that we are free agents, and we can't get out of that idea without a lot of practice until we come to see that everything happens by the will of God. Before that, self-effort is required. So choose one or the other modes of self-effort. Okay, so that is all. So let me give the closing prayer. Om Niranjanam Nityam Anantarupam Bhaktanukampa Dhृतविग्रहं Vai Ishavataram Parameshamidhyam Tam Ramakrishnam Shirasa Namama. We bow in adoration to Sri Ramakrishna, who is stainless, eternal, infinite, the worshipful Supreme Lord, who took human birth out of compassion for all. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat. Om peace, peace, peace be unto us and to all the beings of the universe.